what do you think happens when an entire nation like just a massive country declares war on birds?
I mean, it sounds like the setup to a joke, honestly.
Right. It really does. But the punchline is that, well, millions of people end up dying, between 15 and 45 million people.
Yeah. It's genuinely one of the most harrowing things in the historical record.
So welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking the mechanics of China's 1958 initiative, the Great Leap Forward. And whether you are a student of history or just, someone trying to understand how massive systems fail, this deep dive is basically a masterclass in the terrifying cost of silence.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really unpack the specific mechanics of this tragedy. We want to look at how a series of ideologically driven decisions coming straight from the top just cascaded into one of the most devastating man-made catastrophes ever.
Because it wasn't a natural disaster, right? It was policy.
Right, completely man-made. We are exploring what actually happens on a purely physical and logistical level when rigid ideology just completely severs its connection to ground-level reality.
Okay, so to understand how a famine of this unbelievable scale even begins, we have to look at the very foundation of the food supply, right? The agricultural system.
Yeah, you have to start with the farms.
So the historical baseline here is 1958. The government's goal was, frankly, massive. They wanted to transform a primarily agrarian farming nation into a modern industrial superpower, literally overnight.
Which usually requires massive capital investment, decades or centuries of development.
Right, money and time that they just didn't have.
Yeah.
So the strategy was to use the one resource they had in abundance, which was human labor.
Yeah, and that is the core premise of the leap. I mean, industrialization in the West took centuries, right? You had gradual development, technological advancement, urbanization.
A slow burn.
Exactly. But the ideological goal in 1958 was to just bypass all of that, just skip the natural economic progression entirely.
Just leap over it, hence the name.
Right. So the policy started by fundamentally altering how people lived and worked. Farmers were stripped of their private property and pushed into these massive people's communes.
Which is a huge disruption right off the bat.
Huge. But the real pivot point of the disaster, the thing that really set it off, was the steel obsession.
Oh man, this steel obsession. This part is just wild to me.
So to catch up with the West, the government decided they needed steel, and they needed it immediately. So they ordered everyday citizens to just produce it themselves.
In what they call backyard furnaces.
Yes. Literally building furnaces in their backyards.
Okay, I really need to unpack the physics of this because it honestly baffles me. You can't just, wish steel into existence.
You really can't. The chemistry doesn't care about your ideology.
Right, because iron ore has impurities in it, mostly carbon. And to burn off those impurities to make usable steel, you need blast furnaces that hit, well over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, extremely high heat, specialized equipment.
So how on earth did an entire apparatus of state planners think that everyday citizens could achieve 3,000 degrees in a backyard wood fire?
Well, the short answer is they didn't achieve it. And the planners who actually understood metallurgy, the scientists, they were silenced.
They couldn't speak up.
No, because speaking up meant you were against the revolution. A backyard furnace fueled by wood or coal might hit, maybe 1,500 degrees on a really good day.
Which is only half of what you need.
Right. It's barely enough to melt iron, let alone burn off the carbon to make steel. And here's the other problem. Everyday people didn't have raw iron ore just lying around in their fields.
So what did they melt?
The state ordered them to melt down their essential tools.
That's the part that breaks my brain.
People threw their farming plows, their axes, even their cast iron cooking pots into these low-temperature fires.
Just to meet a quota.
Exactly. And the result of melting down a good cast iron pot in a 1,500-degree fire is this brittle, highly carbonized material called pig iron.
Pig iron. Which is basically useless.
Completely useless. It shatters if you hit it. You cannot build tractors or girders or modern infrastructure out of pig iron.
Okay, let's make this relatable for you listening. Think of it with a practical analogy. Melting down your only farming plow to make brittle iron so you can be an industrial power? It's like burning down your own kitchen to build a luxury dining room.
That's a great way to put it.
Sure, you might have a great room eventually, but now you have absolutely no way to cook dinner. The immediate result of destroying all these tools was that the agricultural fields were just left unharvested.
Because the very implements they needed to gather the food were melted down into useless blobs of metal.
It's just devastating. How does the government ignore something so fundamental?
Well, this is what happens when the metric of success in a society shifts from empirical results to absolute ideological obedience. The physical laws of the universe, like metallurgy, are treated as mere suggestions.
Like they don't apply to the regime.
Right. Acknowledging that the backyard furnaces were producing garbage metal or that crops were rotting in the fields because all the plows were gone, that would mean acknowledging that the central ideology was flawed.
And in a totalitarian system, you just can't do that.
It's a fatal admission. So the reality on the ground was simply ignored. The state needed a success story, so they just pretended it was working.
But you can't pretend away starvation. Because the backyard furnaces destroyed the tools, the harvest obviously plummeted. But again, a totalitarian state cannot admit an ideological failure.
No, they have to find a scapegoat.
They needed something to blame for the missing grain. Enter the sparrows.
Yes. The war on birds.
This shifts the entire catastrophe from an industrial failure to a full-blown ecological disaster.
It really does. The historical narrative takes this surreal turn against nature itself. The government declared war on what they called the four pests.
And the sparrow was the main target, right?
Yeah. The sparrow was identified as a primary enemy of the state because the claim was that these birds were eating the nation's grain.
So they blamed the birds for the food shortage.
Exactly. It wasn't the melted plows, it was the birds.
The logistics of the extermination method for these birds is it's hard to wrap my head around. Because they didn't just use poison or traps, did they?
No, it was much more brute force than that. Millions of citizens were mobilized to just constantly, relentlessly beat drums, bang on pots, and make a deafening noise.
Literally just standing outside banging pots and pans together.
Everywhere. Entire cities, entire countrysides. The goal was to keep the sparrows flying in a constant state of panic.
Because they couldn't land to rest.
Right, until they literally dropped out of the sky from sheer cardiovascular exhaustion.
I mean, I understand the concept of mass mobilization. But how do you override basic ecological observation here? Did absolutely no one point out that disrupting an apex predator might have systemic consequences?
Well, again, in an environment where the ideological mission is the only thing that matters, scientific reality, ecology, biology, they're all treated as, bourgeois inconveniences.
Right, like science is somehow anti-revolutionary.
Exactly. The intricate web of an ecosystem was just invisible to the state planners. They saw a bird eating a seed, labeled it an enemy, and mandated its removal.
And anyone pointing out the biological risks
would be accused of resisting the Great Leap. You'd be sent to a labor camp, or worse. And think about the physical coordination required to exhaust an entire avian population. It's immense.
Millions of people.
Millions of human beings abandoning their remaining agricultural duties to literally just stand in fields banging pots.
While the crops they're supposed to be tending are just dying. And the ecological blowback was immediate, wasn't it?
Oh, almost instantly. Because sparrows, as any basic ornithologist knows, they don't just eat grain. They are the primary predators of insects.
Right. So without the sparrows keeping the bug population in check.
The insects experienced a catastrophic population explosion, specifically locusts.
Locusts, of course. It's almost biblical.
The biology of the locust actually makes this particularly devastating. When grasshoppers are suddenly allowed to breed unchecked, due to a lack of predators, overcrowding triggers a physiological change.
A spike in their serotonin levels, I read.
Yes. This serotonin spike causes them to literally alter their color, swarm together, and become hypervoracious.
They turn into a swarm.
Exactly. They consume their own body weight in vegetation every single day. So these massive swarms descended on the remaining fields and just devoured whatever tiny amounts of food were left.
So between the locusts eating the plants and the lack of tools to actually harvest anything, the crops were physically destroyed.
Decimated.
But here's the thing. The weather and the pests alone didn't kill 45 million people. Bureaucracy did.
Bureaucracy and fear.
Right. The true cause of the mass starvation was how the system handled or covered up that failure.
This is where we get into the fatal echo chamber. The overarching question you have to ask yourself is, what actually happens to a society when a system makes it physically dangerous to report the truth?
And I'm genuinely confused by the logistics of this cover-up, because the historical record outlines this horrific culture of lies where local officials who were terrified of being punished for low yields just reported record-breaking harvests.
Yeah, they basically made up phantom grain.
But how? How does an entire national bureaucracy fake thousands of tons of grain without anyone from the central government physically checking the silos. Doesn't a state at that level have auditors?
They do. They absolutely have auditors. But the auditors are subject to the exact same bureaucratic terror as the local officials.
So everyone is scared.
Everyone.
Yeah.
It was a phenomenon they called wind exaggeration. So a commune leader would inflate their harvest numbers by, say, 20% just to avoid being labeled a counter-revolutionary.
Okay, I can see that. Survival instinct.
Right. Then the provincial governor receives that inflated number, and he inflates it by another 20% to impress the central committee.
Oh, wow. So it compounds.
It compounds all the way up.
Yeah.
By the time the report reaches the top, a starving province is listed as having this massive, record-breaking agricultural surplus.
Well, what about the physical silos? If an auditor went to check?
If an auditor actually went to check the silos, local cadres would literally move the same small batch of grain from silo to silo, just sneaking it ahead of the inspector's route.
You gotta be kidding, like a shell game.
Literally a shell game. Or they would line the bottom of the huge silos with wood or stalks and just put a thin layer of real grain on top.
Just to make it look full.
Yes. And the auditor, who, remember, also wanted to report good news back to his bosses, would gladly accept the illusion. They didn't dig too deep.
Because digging deep meant finding the truth. And the truth was dangerous.
Exactly.
So believing these vastly inflated numbers, or at least pretending to believe them, the central government acted on them. They swooped into the farming villages and confiscated almost all the actual grain that existed.
Because according to the paperwork, the villages had plenty to spare.
Right. So they took it to feed the expanding cities, or they exported it to other countries to show off the success of their economic policies. And that left the peasants, the people who actually grew the food, with literally zero food.
The tragic irony of it is just profound. The rural population, the people tasked with feeding the nation, was the very first to be systematically starved by the nation's policies.
And the physiological reality of this survival phase, reading about it, is agonizing. We are talking about human beings forced to eat tree bark.
Tree bark, boiling leather from their shoes.
Eating grass. People even resorted to eating kale and clay, which, if I understand correctly, tricks the body by stopping the excruciating hunger pains in your stomach, but it completely blasts the digestive tract.
Yeah, it's fatal. It physically fills you up, but you die from it. Entire families just lost all hope in the dark corners of this tragedy.
And because of strict state censorship, the people living in the cities had absolutely no idea the countryside was dying.
The silence was absolute.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Think of a toxic corporate culture where middle management is just too terrified to tell the CEO that the company is broke.
That's a really good modern equivalent.
Right. So they forge the accounting, the CEO thinks everything is great and keeps spending, and the whole company goes under. Only here, the currency wasn't money. It was human lives.
A system built on fear guarantees its own destruction by severing its feedback loop with reality. When local officials are more afraid of their superiors than they are of widespread starvation, truth is effectively outlawed.
It's outlawed.
The central government was operating in a total fantasy world constructed by the terrified lies of its own subordinates. So that estimated death toll, the 15 to 45 million, it isn't just an agricultural failure, it is the mathematical result of institutionalized silence.
Wow. Mathematical result of institutionalized silence. That hits hard. Now, with millions dying, you would think the international community might step in, right? Or that a government facing such a crisis would secretly, quietly ask for help.
I would hope so.
But international geopolitics and sheer national pride sealed the fate of the countryside.
Yeah.
This brings us to the Sino-Soviet split. Right in the middle of this disaster, China's relationship with its primary global ally, the Soviet Union, completely fractured.
It was terrible timing.
Why exactly did that relationship collapse at such a critical moment?
Well, it was a fundamental ideological friction. Following the death of Stalin, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev began this process of de-Stalinization. He was pushing for more peaceful coexistence with the West.
Which didn't sit well with Beijing.
Not at all. The leadership in China viewed this as a complete betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles. They saw themselves as the true, pure inheritors of the hardline communist revolution, and this ideological clash just escalated rapidly.
And the timing, as we said, could not have been worse, because the Soviet Union had been providing massive technical and economic support, right?
Oh, yeah. Literal blueprints, heavy machinery, thousands of engineers to aid in China's industrialization.
So what happens when the split happens?
Because of the ideological split, the Soviets abruptly withdrew all their technicians overnight. They packed up and left.
And they took the blueprints with them.
Took the blueprints, stopped the shipments, and furthermore, they demanded that China immediately pay back its massive debts. And cruelly, they demanded that payment in the form of food.
Food that China obviously did not have.
Right. But because the Chinese government had been broadcasting to the global community that they had these record-breaking agricultural surpluses,
Oh man, the lies caught up to them.
the Soviets called their bluff. They essentially said, "You have a surplus, great, pay us in grain."
Internal lies meeting external geopolitical pressures.
Mm.
The state had to maintain the illusion, right?
Exactly that. They couldn't admit they were starving because that would prove the Soviets right,
And so they actually exported the grain, they put it on trains and shipped it out.
while their own people ate clay.
And they actively refused international aid from other countries too, right?
Yes. The Red Cross, other nations, they offered help. China refused.
They chose to suffer alone, exporting real food, just to prove to the rest of the world that their internal system was flawless. It's one thing to make a policy mistake. We all make mistakes. But to refuse a lifeline when your house is burning down, just to prove to the neighbors that your house is fireproof.
Yeah.
At what point does national pride cross the line into total institutional delusion?
It crosses into delusion the exact moment the preservation of the state's image becomes more important than the preservation of human life.
Which is exactly what happened here.
This is why historians explicitly classify this as a man-made catastrophe. It wasn't driven by a drought. It wasn't a natural flood. It was a famine engineered by pride and sustained by geopolitical isolation.
A calculated decision.
Entirely calculated. Admitting failure on the world stage would have delegitimized the ruling ideology. So they chose the famine. When ideology refuses to bow to reality, it is always the everyday people at the very bottom of the hierarchy who pay the ultimate price.
So how did it finally end? Because obviously the country didn't collapse entirely.
The nightmare only finally stopped when the central government, operating entirely behind closed doors, could no longer mathematically deny the scale of the horror. The bodies were just too numerous.
They couldn't hide the missing millions?
No. So they quietly halted the most extreme initiatives of the Great Leap. And crucially, they permitted farmers to own small, private plots of land again.
So they essentially reverted to the very system they had tried to destroy in the first place.
Exactly. But only after tens of millions of lives had been extinguished. It is a profound historical lesson about the absolute limits of top-down control.
It really is. I mean, we started this deep dive with everyday people melting down their cooking pots to make useless pig iron, just ignoring the basic physics of metallurgy. And we saw the state mandate the extermination of an apex predator, completely blind to the biological blowback of a locust explosion.
Ignoring ecology entirely.
And finally, we saw the lethal combination of bureaucratic fear and geopolitical pride that allowed a massive famine to rage in absolute secret.
Yeah, and while this is a massive nation-state level event from, over half a century ago, the mechanics of it are still so relevant.
How so?
Well, the fear of speaking truth to power, the willingness to ignore complex natural realities for short-term ideological wins. These are dynamics that still exist in human systems today.
Because human nature hasn't really changed.
Exactly. The desire of leadership to hear only good news and the fear of subordinates to deliver bad news, that remains a constant threat in literally any hierarchical organization.
We've seen the devastating cost of silence in 1958. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to sort of mull over, something that connects this history to the very near future.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Think about the algorithmic and AI systems we're building today. What happens when an immensely powerful AI is given a single rigid metric to optimize? Like, say, maximizing user engagement or hitting a specific financial quota without any nuanced understanding of the complex human ecosystem it's actually operating within.
That is a terrifying parallel.
Right. If an algorithm is told to optimize for steel at all costs, it won't care if it has to melt down the proverbial plows to do it. The moment we build systems, whether they're political bureaucracies in the 1950s or artificial intelligences today, that optimize for a single ideological goal while outlining the complex, uncomfortable truth of reality, well, we're planting the seeds of our own collapse.